The consolidation means that the people who own the media have a self-interest in controlling the narrative such that the power is only vested in them and everybody else has to beg.
That's why they call it Mondays
With Mike.
with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
Let's see here. Okay, let's move to this. Netflix is no longer bidding for the WB. Paramount will win if the deal goes through. Now, we previously thought that it was going to be Netflix who won. NBC seems to have indicated this to us. But apparently the bids were ongoing, and now Netflix is going to pull out. We discussed at that time how prices would go up, but perhaps more than that, Warner Brothers owns CNN, and David Ellison, a friend of Trump, is CEO of Paramount. Does this represent further media consolidation in a way that may be deleterious to free-functioning dialogue?
Oh, yeah. It's going to lead major media corporations being owned by all of 4 or 5 people or companies, which is crazy. There was a time where the media used to have hundreds of different groups and stakeholders, but we're in an era right now of not just consolidation of the media in terms of the various facets of controlling what we see and what we hear. You see this with newspapers, with Bezos and the Washington Post, and you see it with the guy who owns the LA Times when they stopped the endorsements. But now you're seeing it with social media, that there is definitely a thumb on the scale, and that thumb on the scale is in a more rightward direction because you have Musk, who has X, formerly known as Twitter, and now you have Ellison and his group that are all very much friends of the Trump administration and acquaintances. Like, they're not a countervailing voice. And so what you're getting right now is you've got Fox, you've got X, you've got TikTok, you've got now if this goes through without any hitch, unless the federal government says it's just too big, it's too close to a monopoly, they can't do it. I'm not holding my breath. I don't think this administration really cares all that much about preventing monopolies, not in any real way. So what's going to happen is a huge portion. They've got radio, right? You saw that with the Titanic battle between CBS and that company that owns so many of those radio stations, where they're trying to dictate Kimmel's programming and they're trying to get it off the air. And at least for Kimmel, the situation held because Disney saw the writing on the wall when thousands canceled their subscriptions, when a significant number of people, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, spoke with one voice in the one thing that corporations essentially used to listen to and should be listening to still, where they said, we are not going to buy your product anymore if you do this, ABC, Disney, of firing Kimmel just because the president wants Kimmel fired. And Disney backed down. My worry is that the forces involved here, the Ellisons and these very wealthy billionaires, may not face those same kinds of pressures because Disney faced that pressure for money reasons, that they were going to lose a lot of revenue all of a sudden and their stock went way down. It's not so clear that kind of impact would happen if Paramount were to take over CNN and then make CNN more like Fox or something. It's not so clear that their business model depends on subscribers in the way that Disney does, because Disney is very much like how do I phrase it? Their business model heavily depends on consumers engaging with their media and their attractions across a wide array of things. So think the theme parks, the cruises, tourism, and people showing up and going to the quote unquote happiest place on earth, right? Like, their entire business model heavily depends on people liking Disney. It's not so clear to me that the business model of Warner Brothers or Paramount under Ellison, should this deal go through, actually would depend on that kind of pressure. And so the ability to respond with something like a boycott or to speak with your money may not have as a considerable effect. So we saw this with Twitter, right? Even when Musk shows up and fires a huge amount of the Twitter staff, removes a bunch of the safeguards, X loses a bunch of their the users and people just drift away. It wasn't enough to make him change course for profitability. Like he was willing to lose a huge amount of money with X to still control the message, and then we got Trump. That's where we're headed, is that these are people who are wealthy enough, clearly, that they can afford to lose a lot of money before they change course. And that money may not be as persuasive to them than the political argument of more control or more authoritarian control, or whatever it is that their end game is, that they want to move away from a democracy and more towards a neo-feudal, whatever you want to call it, trillionaires owning space and siphoning away resources with AI and technology so that they control all the means of production and we get the scraps that they allow us to live on. I don't know, but we're headed in that direction. The more monopolies there are of this nature where you don't have competing voices questioning every step of the way, is this the right decision? Are we doing the right thing? And also, it has to be said, there's a lot less scrutiny on the Trump administration from the pro-Trump media outlets than there is from the non-pro-Trump media outlets in terms of things like corruption, things like holding public officials accountable for their words and their actions by actually scrutinizing if they're doing their job, if they're showing up, if they're actually doing what they say they're doing, if the money's being spent where they say it's being spent. All that stuff requires journalists who are actually committed to doing journalism. And part of the issue with this kind of merger of people who are obviously in the camp of a sort of Trumpian world of money is everything and just listen to the sort of Epstein class kind of issue. We're seeing it play out now. There's a lot less scrutiny for certain kinds of stories, certain kinds of questions about moves that are made in regards to things like corruption and purchases and all sorts of things from the sort of propaganda wing of the media landscape right now. And this is moving one of the largest news organizations in the country, CNN, in a direction more towards something like Fox, news as entertainment, than actual news, actual scrutiny, actual investigations, looking into stories and doing research and interviews and really digging deep into the numbers and the data, all the records requests that are involved with doing journalism. We're going to see less of that with this new ownership, is my opinion. That's what I anticipate is if this actually goes through. Look, Netflix, I think, would have just been focused on what will make us the most money and what will retain our subscriber base because they're a subscription based business model. So they absolutely have to give the public what they crave, which was, in the case of CNN, like real journalism, real news. I'm not so sure that Paramount it has the same kinds of pressures because so much of the money is being footed by the billionaires, right? That in order to make the winning bid, they had to commit just gargantuan sums of money that wasn't publicly held, put it that way. Just huge amounts of money, just so much money to get the winning bid. And look, there's one thing I learned more than anything else studying political science and getting the degree and study was that the return on investment for the moneyed interests spending money on politics is like 1,000-fold. So if you donate $1,000, $10,000, or $100,000, whatever that amount, you get way more back from the government in doing that. And so this is something similar to that. This is why you see these moves of, for instance, the Trump ballroom being funded by these private interests, or all these like different the inauguration, all these different things where very wealthy people just dump huge amounts of money into the government because they see a return. These people don't spend money unless they see a return on that money. You don't get to be as wealthy and as powerful as these people are. It just doesn't really happen unless someone inherits it, which some did, right? There are some people who inherit billions of dollars and millions of dollars. But for the ones who didn't, who had to carve out their little slice of the pie, they don't move without thinking 10, 20, 100 steps ahead, right? If they do something, they're expecting something in return. And the question I have is what precisely is Paramount getting out of this if they make it, if they create a situation that pushes us closer to the midterms. The worry I have is that, say the Democrats do win the midterms, but then Trump does what he did after 2020 and he says, it was all a hoax and there's corruption and issues, blah, blah, blah. And then the media doesn't push back, similar to how they did for January 6th. It's going to put us in a really difficult position in the country because people are going to have to actually protest in the streets, like civil rights era level protests of nonviolent resistance of walking millions of people all around the country saying, no, this is not right. If there's an overwhelming vote to replace Congress with, and look, historically, that's what happens in the midterms right after a president gets elected. It's that the House switches power as a check, right? Checks and balances. If that doesn't happen, and it paves the way for Trump to act like a dictator for the next however many years, this move, this merger of Paramount and Warner Brothers and all the media entities makes that easier, right? It paves the way even better. And yeah, this is again one of those moments. So the fighting with Iran is a moment for international politics. Are we going to get into another forever war? This thing with Paramount and Warner Brothers, it's not just a money thing. It's a politics thing. It's domestic politics. It's going to get really contentious. There's going to be a lot of lawsuits. Anyways, that's for the future, right? We don't even know if this deal is going to still go through because it has to still get approved by the federal government to make sure that it's not antitrust, that it's not a monopoly.
Yeah, I was interested to see Christine Romans on NBC say it really can't be overstated how big of a sea change this would be if the deal went through. But there wasn't, like, an explanation as to what was at stake exactly in terms of could the Ellisons take editorial control over CNN, and could it be a matter where with CBS that story got canceled and it was wondered why?
Yeah, that was actually what I was going to say, is that if you want an example of what it's going to look like, 60 Minutes, the longest running, most famous news program in the United States, it's got the most viewers, it's been around for a very long time. They had a story. The story was going to be published and shown to the world. And then at the very last second, in the midnight hour, it got shut down. And why did it get shut down? Because they didn't hear enough from the Trump administration. That's what the publicly stated reason was that I read, was that they didn't have enough input from the group that the journalists were criticizing. And last I checked, for the history of journalism, generally, journalists didn't hesitate to publish stories because they didn't acquiesce enough to the people that they were reporting on. Last I checked, journalism speaks truth to power, not the other way around. So what we're headed towards is power decides what truth is. And that's a world, or that's 1984 level stuff of rewriting history. And we're seeing that play out actually on a much smaller scale, but it's definitely happening, where at George Washington's, the president's home in, I think it was Pennsylvania, where they tried to remove any mention of the slaves that George Washington owned. And it got brought to court, and the Trump administration lost there. The judge was like, you can't rewrite history just because you control the message for now. That the administration, simply because it has the ability to use power right now as a temporary custodian of the public trust and lands and resources, doesn't mean that it owns it forever. And history is something that we all benefit from understanding and knowing, because it helps to understand. If we understand the past, it better helps us to understand how to navigate to a better future. Ostensibly, that's the idea. Otherwise, we're blind wandering through the world. If we learn nothing from our mistakes, we'll just keep making those same mistakes. But it's really difficult to learn from your mistakes if you never admit that mistakes have been made in any context ever. And that's something from the Trump administration an awful lot, is that even if there's things that appear wildly outrageous, incredibly egregious, things that are just so beyond the pale, in Trump 2.0, there's a lot more of an effort to just hold the line to just say, nope, not going to fire people. There's definitely a reticence now, if mistakes get made, to actually fire anyone, to actually do any kind of investigation of any kind, to actually reprimand anyone in any circumstance. And that's part of the issue, is that if power dictates the truth to us, we're seeing that they shape the narrative in a way that makes it look like nothing bad happens, even when it seems, at least on the face of it, if you look at the video or you look at the reporting, that bad things did happen, that the story that's being told just isn't, that it's something else. That's what you need journalists to do, because that's their job, that they will ferret out what the real truth is. We're moving into a place where it's increasingly becoming less and less actual journalists delivering ostensibly what is news or news-like stuff to us, to the consumer, the public, the voting public. Remember, Fox went to court and they admitted that they were entertainment at one point. I think it was the Tucker Carlson lawsuit, where it was essentially like, don't necessarily believe everything we say is truth. We're entertainment. We're here to make money by having like newsiness, things that seem true but aren't necessarily true. And they said it in court. Where else to believe them than the place where they have to tell the truth or they face criminal sanction? So yeah, that's what I think about when I think of anything like this happening, of propaganda-like behavior happening, is that they're moving more towards like infotainment, generating hype and controversy and like newsiness, but not actual news, not actual hard-hitting Watergate level journalism kind of stuff. Part of the reason that the journalists pursue such incredible efforts to ferret out the truth and find answers is to get a better job, keep their current job as journalists. But if the incentives in the system change from the people who give the money, who hire the journalists, away from actual journalism and more towards quasi acting or whatever you want to call a clown show, then that incentive structure no longer really exists in our incentive driven world, aside from independent media, which gets drowned out because they don't have access to the airwaves, to the television, and to the major radio, not to the level that these companies do. And look, it's a long-term project. This isn't new. When I traveled across the United States, you travel across these, not empty, but these vast fields of farms and cows and lots of ranches and farms, and just, it's not empty, but there's a lot less people. You turn the radio on, all I heard on the radio was either religious services or right-wing talk radio. That was it for huge swaths of the country. There was no countervailing voice. All they were fed was a steady diet of just the same, the Rush Limbaughs of the world and the Hannity and those people on the radio. And now they're transitioning away from not just radio, but now TV with Fox. And that's been an ongoing project. And now it's going to be TV with CNN. We saw there was an effort with ABC, but that at least had some pushback, so they're not completely in the corner of the Trump administration. But who do we turn to for reliable, consistent news, like high quality information?
Yeah, I think that people already don't take the TV news as seriously as they used to. And that TV news, all news, really, but there are still newspapers, and people who read those newspapers believe in those newspapers, and they pay for them mostly. And there's still radio, and it's been at a low level for a while, so I don't think it's been struck all too hard by all this. But television, in terms of trust in it, has fallen off a cliff. And I would guess that there's probably a certain age on average. I would say like birth year sometime in the 1950s. If you get older than that, they probably I saw it on television, therefore I should trust it well enough to act on it. And it's like, when I watch it, I think to myself, it's interesting that you've pinged this to me, television. I will have to look this up in order to find the real take on the matter. And for example, like with NBC, their takes they're always so terse and limited that there's not much chance that they would have really skewed with that. Every once in a while they do, and when I see it, I'm like, oh, don't do that. People can barely trust what they see on the TV as it is, so please don't do that. You're not even doing it that much. Please just don't do it at all. So That's really fallen off a cliff. And I think what you're saying about, I would probably call it the oligarchization of the media, is going to continue here. And it really is going to require us to, just anybody who might be hearing this, to engage with the grassroots. So I drove through the San Joaquin Valley this summer, and I heard a Berkeley radio station, and who was talking on there? I think it was Ralph Nader. I had a dream about Ralph Nader. Was Ralph Nader in the Epstein files?
He wasn't.
I have no idea. I haven't looked at the whole list of names.
He either was, or I had a dream that he was. He probably wasn't. I heard a Berkeley radio station, and I thought to myself, how much would it cost for me to get that podcast broadcast from a radio station? How much? So probably not for us, not at this particular juncture, but for others, how much could it cost, really? There's got to be some sort of grassroots thing that grows up to counter the top-down. And will it happen? I don't know. But it's really the only chance, I think, of counteracting this super corporatization that we've seen going on. You were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to interject with my cynical take on this, which is that for political reasons, these forces, the powers that be, are moving towards consolidating specifically television resources. Because if you look at who subscribes to cable and who still pays for television, that number has been going down over the years. Yeah. That younger people have moved away from like a bundled cable TV package, and the media landscape's become balkanized in that respect, that it's split up into all these streaming services and all this other stuff. But there's one group that consistently still continues to re-up for cable. What group do you think that is?
Elderly.
Yep. And if you look at who actually votes in all the elections, way more than everybody else by a margin that isn't even close, it's the old people. And if all the old people vote the most, you get something like Florida, okay? And Florida is, their government's messy, but
way too hot.
Anyway, the point is that by and large, the elderly vote goes more towards Republicans, and the way that the Republicans are trying to maintain a hold on power, and in a not so subtle way, is to control all of the various ways in which old people consume media. So how do they do that? Have a huge number of right-wing radio stations and radio shows. Have a huge number of right-wing news shows and media that constantly puts out this like propaganda-ish content that hypes up the Trump administration, that magnifies the strengths and hides the weaknesses. They're the hype man for the administration. That they go, yeah, we're so great, they're so awesome, they're so wonderful, everything's awesome, it's a party, everybody's winning, it's so much winning, right? That it masks the reality of what's happening in some cases in the country. And that's how you get dictatorship. That's how you get tyranny. That's how you get autocracy. Whoever controls the actual levers of power and the message, they shape reality to their whim, whatever that whim is. And obviously, for whatever reason, the wealthiest, the billionaires on the right side of the ledger, the Republicans, have made a real effort to control media. If you're talking about radio, and I think it was the Koch brothers for the longest time, were sprinkling money all over the country for conservative races and politicians to try and move the needle just ever so slightly in a more unequal direction. More power for the wealthy in the shape of less taxes and consolidated. It takes three forms, really. It's less taxes, so more money in their hands, which then translates into more money being able to be spent on politics, to translate that into a lower regulatory burden so they can get away with more things by having less scrutiny. How do you have less scrutiny? You put somebody in power who fires all of the investigators, fires all the lawyers, fires all the inspector generals, fires all the oversight, makes a real effort to just fire huge numbers of people from the government whose entire job in some cases was to just sit there in a room staring at thousands of documents every day, trying to ferret out who's actually playing the game fairly. This is something I find extraordinarily frustrating right now in our current political moment. When you're talking about something like fraud, where they're cutting off the Medicaid funds to Minnesota, a circumstance like that, they're punishing the beneficiaries of Medicaid by cutting off their funds. But the person whose fault it is for not catching fraud is the oversight. It's the enforcers. It's the government itself. Instead of looking inward and hiring auditors and regulators and just people whose job it is to do that, to make sure that fraud doesn't happen, they're punishing the people these programs are designed to help. That's complete nonsense. That's cruel. That's the manifestation of cruelty. Because the people who need these services, they need them for a reason, right? These programs are in place to help like the very destitute, the people who really need assistance, the very sick, right? The people. I think Medicaid funds cover dialysis for people on kidney dialysis is one of the things that's covered. That's crazy. If you take away kidney dialysis for people who need it or they die, what happens?
They die.
Or they turn to philanthropy or charity or the state or some other.
Yeah, actually, they would probably, but nevertheless, it would be a huge.
But what happens
problem.
in that circumstance is it diverts resources from what the state was doing with that money, education or spending money on roads or infrastructure or whatever, and it puts a bigger hole and dent in their budget and creates a budget crisis. Which, look, these forces are engaged in the long game. So I'll give you an example. If you create a budget crisis in a state where they have to make very extreme decisions, cut extreme austerity, cut programs, a lot of people suffer, or raise taxes to increase revenue in order to fund the programs that the federal government was paying for but stopped, what's going to happen is it creates this long-term division, this rapprochement between the wealthy interests of the state and everybody else. And then you get a sort of political backlash, and it's an end run to against these democratic states where they know that we saw this happening in Washington, where they were cutting funds for social services, for education, for a bunch of stuff. And Washington stepped up and said, look, we're going to pay for as much as we can if we have to, because we need these services. But what's happening is what you're seeing happening now, where you're going to have either a huge back and forth political battle, and it's a long-term strategy to reduce the strength of democratic politicians and policies and power bases by whittling away at the edges. If you take away the money and if you take away the happiness of the existing constituencies of these places by creating division and discord from the political choices they have to make, the realities that they're confronted with. And that's a very long-term, very unfortunate strategy, because the ones who win in that game are those who can play through attrition, right? Where they can outlast the groups that need the benefits. So if you take away the medical care, or you take away the housing, or you take away the substance abuse treatment, this is just a different version of the Nixon strategy, where one way that they got rid of their political opponents was the war on drugs, and was if I remember correctly, it was the draft. The way you got rid of the hippies and the protest movements was that you drafted people and that you threw hippies in jail. That was, I think his name was Haldeman. It was one of the lieutenants of Nixon. He laid it out that the strategy for Nixon was to put all the people who opposed them in jail to make them felons so they couldn't vote. The strategy right now, it seems, for the Republicans is to make it so that Democratic states in particular, you don't see them taking Medicaid funds from some of these other states. You don't see it happening in Florida, for instance, where they've had a long, very strange history with various allegations of fraud and not great stuff. You don't see that happening. The Trump administration going, we're going to take all Medicaid funding from Florida. No, the focus is on the states that oppose them politically. And the strategy really appears, at least to me, with my learned eye, appears to be to create a serious division by putting them in impossible political situations where they have to make a choice: cut a huge number of programs or raise revenue through measures that have been opposed in the ways that they raise revenue, which will then invite the wealthy and the politically connected and the powerful who may not have been in the fray to jump into the fray and put their money behind the Trumps of the world. That's how you get the billionaires going, I don't want to be taxed more because I like having money. voting for the people who are in favor of tax cuts and ignoring all the other stuff that the people who are in favor of tax cuts do. That's the strategy from the Republicans. It seems to have been that for a very long time. Is that if you make the situation look more inviting and more beneficial in the long run for the ones who have the most money, and then you create a situation where money is speech through Citizens United, through all that long lawsuit and the fights that happened over that, it creates this environment where it goes back to what I said, that return on investment, that if I spend $1,000, I get 100,000, a million in return. These rich people see the avenues for further enrichment. They don't care necessarily about the political environment if they see a way to make more money. And it's a real struggle, right? Because at the end of the day, the ones who suffer the most are those who do not have any kind of access to that level of wealth. If you look at the divide between the rich and the poor in this country, it is exorbitant. There is no way to get to that level aside from very extreme good fortune, like winning the lottery or something, right? There's only a handful of ways that people can actually skyrocket to that level of wealth that these billionaires have. And a few people do, right? Celebrities do. The Kardashians come to mind as one of the big examples of people who used working for a living to skyrocket to the top of the political atmosphere, right? Thinking about the first Trump administration, Kim Kardashian was very effective at getting Trump to issue pardons, for example, for people. And the reason she was able to do that is she had access. And the reason she had access is she was a rich celebrity, right? Most people don't have that level of access. If you look at the current pardons that are being issued by the Trump administration, an awful lot of them seem to be either very wealthy or wealth adjacent, right? And then Trump issues a pardon. I'm thinking of that story of the guy, talking about fraud who made millions from it was either tax evasion or some kind of thing, embezzlement, something and allegedly his mom went to a $1 million plate fundraiser, chatted with Trump. Trump issued a pardon, and then all the restitution that guy had to pay didn't need to be paid. That's the big thing. This is the thing that's not really being talked about as much for the pardons, is that when somebody gets pardoned, they no longer have to pay the restitution. If they stole a bunch of money and they were found guilty of a crime, they had to pay up for all those people that they committed their crime against. When they're pardoned, they no longer have to pay that restitution. So it goes back to that sort of that thing where $1 million instead of paying a $30 million fine, the math isn't. There's if you have no scruples and are willing to engage in very pragmatic. No one said it was illegal for. I didn't say it was illegal for the lady to show up to the $1 million plate fundraiser or whatever and talk to Trump. Remember, the president has absolute power to pardon. He doesn't have to give a reason to pardon. The only check on that is if Congress impeaches him. And because Congress gets to define what a high crime and misdemeanor is. It's not actually spelled out in the Constitution. Congress decides. It's whatever they decide it is. And clearly, they seem to have not decided that getting paid millions of dollars and then pardoning people appears to be acceptable. There's no check. Congress is the one that has the power to check that practice in particular. They're not doing it. That's in your face, like flagrant, like what is going on. Not corruption. I could opine, in my opinion, that it is flagrant corruption for any circumstance where somebody is paid money or has money donated to their political cause, and then, lo and behold, issues a pardon in which the person who's pardoned gets millions of dollars back that they otherwise would not have. It's completely bonkers because then it becomes the price of doing business. Actually, there is an example of somebody who did just that. Somebody who was pardoned in the first Trump administration for fraud and then got pardoned in the second Trump administration for fraud. So it just becomes the price of doing business. If the price of doing business is less than the return, then people are going to engage in this level of criminality. And it's crazy. It's completely nuts. The top law enforcement official in the country is pardoning people who are who are charged and convicted of crimes and who clearly didn't learn their lesson because they went right back to committing the same crime. That's what's insane about this. Is you need a news media. Actually, the only reason I even know about that is that there was some area of the news media that actually talked about this and actually figured out, wait a second, what is going on here? And look, it's a profound failure of the American electorate that they keep electing these politicians who just don't seem to really want to actually provide an effective check on this kind of graft, this kind of corruption. Like, it's a huge failure on the part of the American electorate that they're not educating themselves if they rely so much on the media to just spoon feed them weird political theater like what we're seeing with the Clintons and the testimony there.
Yeah.
That's a topic we're going to talk about a little later. But the more that media gets consolidated, the more the powers that be that are trying to do a long term. Right now, it looks like a long term effort towards neo feudalism. Essentially, they're trying to make us techno serfs, meaning that if they control the means of production through things like AI or access to space technology in particular, humans may have to vie just for even the barest essentials and necessities if there's no means within our economic system for them to have any access to actual income creating things. And that's where you need political leadership. You need something like a basic income, or you need some other kind of social program to bridge the gap. And it's looking an awful lot like the current political realities are not headed in that direction. We're headed in a direction very much towards the arch capitalists becoming the new aristocracy, and it's going to look a lot more like the Middle Ages Europe than it is a thriving, vibrant, cosmopolitan democracy. Like, authoritarianism benefits the very wealthy and the very powerful, and everybody else has to suffer under their boot. And the more that media gets consolidated, the quicker we get to there, because the consolidation means that the people who own the media have a self-interest in controlling the narrative and forcing the situation into one such that the power is only vested in them, and everybody else has to beg, pretty much. We'll see.
Oh, I hate to think that.
We're not there yet, but we're on the way.
So, gotta support independent creators. Okay, so we are well enough alerted to be averse to if CNN gets a new editorial bent. Mondays with Mike.